In 1838, Governor James S. Conway signed legislation establishing the state penitentiary system in Arkansas. A 92-acre tract was subsequently purchased for the first penitentiary at the site of what is now the Arkansas State Capitol. In 1846 and again in 1850, inmates set fire to the building, destroying it, having to be rebuilt each time. The prison was later relocated in 1899 to a site southwest of Little Rock known as the Walls. Overcrowding and the need to segregate inmates led to purchasing about 10,000 acres for the Cummins Farm in 1902. 11 years later, in 1913, a permanent death chamber was constructed within the Cummins facility. The Tucker Farm, of a little over 4,400 acres, was purchased in 1916. Governor Futrell later closed the Walls in 1933, and inmates were moved to the Cummins Farm and to the Tucker facility, where the death chamber was also relocated.
The Act of 1838, which is the beginning of the prison system, is designed to be a rehabilitative system. It's always there for punishment, but it's designed to have rehabilitation as its ultimate goal. And it did that by having inmates work in silence together in the daytime, and then at night they went back to single cells to think about what they had done. And the idea was that, most rational people would see the error of their ways and would get better. Of course, it didn't work that way, but that was the theory behind it. James McVicker, who was the first superintendent of the prisons, tried to make that system work. He tried to make sure inmates had health care, that they were working, and to do all the things we would like for them to do. And he runs into two problems almost immediately. One is the inmates are not going to always cooperate with him. The best example being that they burn the prison down, which is a sure sign of no cooperation. And secondly, it runs into the cost. If you're going to rehabilitate people, it's going to take more money than if you're just going to punish them. And since the state didn't have much money to spend and certainly didn't want to spend it on inmates, then they're never going to put the money into the system to do the rehabilitation.
When the prison didn't function as it should, cost too much money, and the inmates burned the prison, legislators recommended that the prison system be abolished. But realizing there was no alternative but to have a prison system, Arkansas decided to adopt the convict lease system.
The idea basically there is you simply lease all the inmates out, all the property and everything, to a private contractor, and they're allowed to sell the labor. So the state gets out of the cost, but ultimately when you take state supervision away from it and put it in the hands of a private contractor, then what they're going to do is sell the labor as dearly as they can and do as little as they can for the inmates. Probably the most abusive part of the lease system really occurs in the 1870s and 80s when these contractors began to contract to use these inmates in the coal mines in western Arkansas. And that became quite a scandal. There was a lawsuit filed about that. It led to a large investigation in which the state began to look at what was going on out there and found widespread abuse in those mines. Inmates that had died from neglect, being ill-fed, ill-clothed, overworked. There was a backlash in that, and there was an attempt then in the 1880s to reform the system a little bit to try to make sure the state at least really exercised some control over these labor contracts, but they didn't do a lot.
At the turn of the century, the state regains control of the system. This was done mainly because of the scandals and rising public sentiment that the private convict lease system had gone too far. The responsibility of the inmates would then fall in the public sector, where it properly belonged.
By 1910, 1908, there were probably 400 or 500 inmates that were not in the prison system. They were actually leased out, and you had the same problem with them. The people that leased them didn't want to feed them, they didn't want to provide medical care for them, they worked them too hard, the inmates had no recourse about anything. There are actually lawsuits filed by inmates trying to say, hey, this is unconstitutional, you can't do this. Now, the idea of a prison being unconstitutional in the early 20th century America was unheard of, that the idea that inmates had any kind of rights was unheard of, so they didn't get very far with them. The convict lease system is really ended by Governor Donaghy, and in an interesting way, and in a very courageous way. Donaghy was a progressive governor. He didn't like the convict lease system. He saw it as an evil system, and he wanted to get rid of it, and he tried to do that several times with the General Assembly. And the contractors, the people who were making money off of it, always blocked it. He couldn't get it out of the General Assembly. So what he did one day, he called in one of his aides and he said, tell me how many inmates have we got out there that are on the convict lease system? And they said 369. And he said, well, give me 369 pardons. And he pardoned in one swoop about 369 inmates. It raised a furor in the state. You can imagine what that was like to do that, but it broke the back of the convict lease system.
Arkansas, in an effort to operate its prison system with limited resources and money, adopted the inmate trustee system.
Inmate trustees just mean that they are inmates who have been given some level of trust. It used to be that an inmate trustee watched other inmates and was usually armed. They may be in the towers at the institution, or they may be out on the farm armed, watching a crew working the farm.
The trustee system had its place, and that time it worked as well as it could. But it did bring its own set of problems. I mean, when you have heavy inmates, what we call heavy inmates, people who were actually making decisions and running the living units of the institution, and when they have power over other inmates, it makes for a bad situation.
Every day there were inmates armed. In this day and age, you think of that, you hear that, all you can do is shake your head. Like, what kind of sense does that make? Well, back then, when you were a cash-strapped state, trying to save every penny you could, it made a lot of sense. It wasn't necessarily the safest, and certainly not the most secure way to run a prison system, but that's the way it was.
Back then, when I went to work at the blood bank, if I didn't get the right waive or clearance from an inmate at the door, then they may fire a .30-06 round out there and get your attention. So, and sometimes it was the craziest inmate it seemed to be the craziest inmate in the population that they'd have on the tower with a rifle. It was interesting.
People came into the penitentiary, law enforcement, and they turned their weapon over to an armed trustee. And there might only be a handful of free world employees on at night. There are 1,500 inmates. The rest of the supervision was done by other inmates, and that's how you save money. But that's also the way you create something that's rough and tumble and eventually is declared unconstitutional.
In 1970, Arkansas became the first state in the Union to have its whole correctional system declared unconstitutional. Federally supervised for 12 years, Arkansas's prison system regained its constitutional status in 1982.
I guess the first thing that had to happen was Arkansas had to size up itself. Arkansas had to decide, do we want to stay like this, or do we want to get better? And Arkansas said, let's get better. So the first thing that has to happen is a change of mind. Then you have to start investing. You have to invest people, you have to invest time, and you have to invest a lot of money. And over the years, Arkansas has done that. Because what Arkansas looked like in 1970 is not what it looks like in 2009. I mean, we've got some of the same facilities, we've got some of the same buildings, but what's inside of those buildings and how those buildings are run are worlds apart.
Right before the federal court was filed and Governor Rockefeller was trying to reform the prison system, one of the suggestions that came out of the study group was to go to the classification system, which is what most states use. The classification system is based on the idea that you look at an inmate not necessarily for the crime they committed, but their risk. So if you can get them classified right, you can really solve a lot of the problems in the prison system. And it also becomes an incentive because the higher up you move, if you're class 4, you have almost no privileges. If you're class 1, you have more privileges. So it becomes an incentive for those inmates to do better.
We develop a plan for them, a correctional plan, that says while you're here, you need to get your GED, you need to address that substance abuse problem. We'd really like you to go to VOTEC, and you've got to take anger management because you've got some issues.
Well, for us, execution time is probably the most difficult part of our job. I know as Director of Corrections, it's my most difficult task. Since 1990, I really can't tell you the number that we've carried out, but I've been involved in all of them. I presided over all but the first 3 or 4. It's not something that you remember or try to remember. You take care of the business and then you move on to something else. It's an enormous task, and I mean, everyone from the governor down to the newest correctional officer one at Cummins is involved, and we do it, and we do the best we can to do it well and with the fewest problems that we can have. But it's just there's not anything good to say about it except that you get it done and then you move on. If I never do another one, it'll be fine with me.
It's interesting to me that the prison system has come full circle. It started out with the idea that we would rehabilitate inmates and punish them. That idea of rehabilitation disappears up until about the 1970s in the court cases, and rehabilitation begins to slowly come back in the system and to be important. So the prison has great programs for rehabilitation, but unless you want to be rehabilitated, they're not going to do you any good. And that's really a spiritual conversion, I think. Somebody has to decide for whatever reason that they want to be a better person. It's hard to tell how that happens. I mean, some people, it may be religion, some people it may be their family, and some people just may have an awakening and decide, I want to be different. And if that ever happens, then I really think you can take the assets that we have and give them the tools they need to survive, and they've got a good chance of making it. In the end, it's a personal decision.